Hello and welcome to part 3 of my skin painting tutorial. It's a direct continuation of the previous 2 videos, so you're not going to learn any vastly new techniques or anything like that. It's just a case of refinement and finishing the areas of the skin so that they're as neat and precise as you can make them now. The colours on the palette are the same colours that we've been using in the previous videos. The skin, the 4 skin colours down the left are made from Cadian Fleshtone and Pallid Witch Flesh. The top colour is pure Cadian, the bottom is pure Pallid Witch Flesh, and the 2 colours in between are obviously various mixtures of the 2 colours to create that transition. The reason I do that is so that it's easy to make quick transitions. You could, if you wanted, use wet blending, just use these 2 colours, put one down, put the base colour down, put the highlight down, blend them together on the model, but this just makes it a little bit more controlled. The other 3 colours on the wet palette are Eldandil Violet, it's a scale colour fantasy paint, and there's Rhinox Hide and Balor Brown. They're slightly thicker than you may realise, but I want that way so that I can paint in the shadows and some of the details quickly and make a very positive mark. I'm going to do another video purely on paint consistency because I keep getting messages from people struggling with the consistency of paint, and I'm going to explain how glazes work and how thick you need paint to do different things. But for the case of this video, it's basically 2 paint consistencies. There's the paint that I want to make a positive mark, which is on the wet palette, and the paint that's on the little wells just above the wet palette, and those are all glazes. It looks like there's just one colour in 2 wells on the top palette. Unfortunately, it's too big and round to fit on the video, but you will get the general idea of how they work. It's not one colour, it's actually 2 separate colours. It's Balor Brown and Cadian Fleshtone, and what you're seeing is the Cadian Fleshtone, when you turn it into a glaze, the pigment separates in it, so it looks yellow. But when I use the glaze, I'll dip the brush right into the glaze and get it a good amount on, so the paint still mixes again on the brush. But you have to be a little bit careful when you glaze with certain colours because they will separate. Other colours on that wheel are Skavenblight Dinge, which I use to desaturate some of the colours, particularly the Cadian Fleshtone. When that's painted on the model, it's a very healthy, vibrant kind of flesh, and that's a little bit bright for what I want in some areas. So instead of just making that more grey and working with grey skin tones all over, I use the glaze because it gives me more control and lets me have some areas still of a vibrancy, so I can create contrast between rotten skin and slightly more healthy looking skin. Because this is all refinement painting on the belly, you'll see that I hardly put any paint on the brush. It's just a tiny amount, very small marks. They're so small it's very hard to see them. This kind of painting, it takes a long time. I mean, the video here is it's over 40 minutes long, and you're not going to see vast changes in what I'm doing. This is more to display level for the stage 3 of the video. However, I will also be painting the arm with the rusted sword on, which is starting from a much earlier point, so you're going to still see some of the skin painting that you'd seen in the previous videos, as well as some of the fine detail painting. You'll notice that I hardly use any of the pure witch flesh paint while I'm doing the refining. The reason for this is that is only the very highest highlight point. You want to be very careful using it. It's almost tiny area, tiny spots on the model. If you use too much of that, it completely takes over and destroys any subtleties in the transitions. So it's almost like little glimmer white spots, but I haven't used any white, any pure white in the painting of the skin. The main reason for that is I wanted the white for the non-metallic metal on the shoulder, and if you highlight every highlight point on the model to white, it makes it look very bland. It desaturates it a bit, and it's just boring and wrong, because every light point is the same. Whereas if you use the white just to make the shiniest things shine, those things will look different in texture and material. So the skin isn't shiny like metal, and it's lower down on the model, so it wouldn't have such strong light hitting it. You also might notice, well, you will now because I'm telling you, but the brush that I'm using is smaller than I've been using on the previous videos. This time I'm using a size 0 broken toed brush. I'm using that because I want to make purely small marks on the belly. I think I occasionally go back to the worn out size 1 every now and then with some as I change my mind on how I want areas on the skin to look, which I do because I want some of the rotten areas on the skin to come into focus more, and but without them completely overwhelming the model. Well, I explain that as it gets to it on the video. Now here you can see I've used a straight Rhinox hide paint. I'm using the thin brush still, but because this area on the arm is so in shadow, I want to separate some of the shapes out on the folds of flesh, and if I just glaze that area, it would sort of go into one tone. Whereas if I'm using the stronger colour, it's almost like outlining these shapes, and then I can glaze it on top. So as you see the paintbrush go out of shot there on the palette, I'm using, well, I've used some Rhinox hide, and I also changed my mind, and then I've gone back to pick out some of the pustules. And the reason I did that was because as I keep painting the shadows and contrast on the model, you lose some of the detail in those areas, especially because it's such a shadowed area on the model, and that can kind of you kind of lose focus on what you're doing sometimes, because you forget that there are areas of contrast and spots that need to stand out. So by painting in those little yellow pustules, I'm able to remind myself that I need to make that area work with that colour. Now, unfortunately, I pulled the palette closer a bit there, but I wanted to be I wanted easy access to the palette. It was a bit far away from me, but I'll try and explain as I go on what colours I'm using if you can't see them. Now I'm using Rhinox High still, and you'll see here that I've actually been a bit naughty. When I did that, the brush was really loaded and I put it on. And I've mentioned before how to glaze it. You're supposed to rub the paint off before you glaze it, but sometimes I'm not just using it as a glaze. So the mixture is for glazing, but you can still use it as a wash. And what happens is, if you use it as a wash, the paint pools a little bit and it kind of just flows into the recesses more. You just have to be a bit careful and remember that that will stay wetter for a lot longer than the glaze. So this area on the model is a thigh, and I realised that as the leg was stepping forward, it needed to be much brighter than I started to paint it in the previous videos. So it's almost painting from stage 1 to brighten these areas up. Now I'm also at some stage in this video going to highlight this area. Oh, I think I'm doing it more now. Yeah, there we go. Highlighting this area more, which is right next to the rotten necrotic flesh that I painted on. Now the problem with that area was that I'd made the rotten flesh so large that it was dominating that part of the model, and I couldn't get any details in there. What I really wanted was the more healthy flesh to contrast with the rotten flesh. So I've had to go back, starting from pure Cadian Fleshtone, and then I'll eventually add layers and blend it in to that necrotic flesh, so it's got a nice contrast. It makes, even though the area of the necrotic flesh is smaller, it makes it more of an interesting point. It's actually a harder thing to do that I'm doing there to blend in that necrotic flesh, because I'd painted it dark. When I started painting this, I'd already got the model base coated with the Cadian Fleshtone, so it was much easier to get the shading on, because it's always easier to shade a model down from a bright colour than it is to put a bright colour on a dark colour, because the dark usually will show through really easily. So it just means that you have to do a lot more layers and be a lot more controlled with how you do it to get a nice finish. You saw that I spanned the wheel around a bit more there, so you can see the other colours on the wheel there. It's I've mixed up glazes of the Pallid witch flesh and the Skavenblight Dinge. I find that the grey colours are much easier to glaze with as well. They're nice. They tend to bring other colours together. They desaturate them a bit, and it helps creating nice transitions. But you have to be careful, because if you use it too much, it will make everything look dull and grey. However, if you use it carefully, you can then allow patches of darkness to contrast with nice warmer colours. It just gives you that little bit more fun to play with when getting the colours onto the skin. You might notice that it's possibly a bit annoying, but I apologise for that. I keep jumping backwards and forwards between painting the arm, painting the belly. The reason for this is I want the paint to dry a bit as I work on it. I may have mentioned this in previous videos, but if you work over the top of paint and it's not dried properly, you'll risk damaging that paint layer. You pull paint off of it, which leaves it looking patchy. It's very hard to fix because as you paint layers over that to correct those issues, the layer also goes on the paint that wasn't damaged, which then gets more saturated. So you can end up with a case where which is a problem if you've been using glazes, because if the colour that you've been glazing on doesn't go all the way to a fully saturated colour that you've been using, some of the previous colour will be visible beneath it. So you will still be adding these glazes to correct these issues that you've done by damaging the paint layer, but you're still adding more paint to the area around the damaged paint layer, which will then become more saturated. So as the damaged paint slowly fills in, it's still leaving a contrast between the paint that wasn't damaged because you've made it a stronger colour. So you have to be very careful not to damage the paint layer. So it's a good idea to jump between different areas of the model while you're waiting for paint to dry, particularly if you're glazing. Now the sort of painting that I'm doing on the arm, because the arm isn't so big as the belly, you have to use slightly smaller marks, brush strokes, which it means that it's not as easy to get nice smooth colours. However, because it's a smaller area to get those brush strokes, it also means you cover them more quickly. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts to what's more fun and easier to paint. But I tend to use a smaller brush on these areas so that I can still pick out some of the details a bit. It gets a bit more fiddly, but because there's all this detail on the skin folds. Normally, I mean, if you're painting a model that wasn't Nurgle and didn't have all these layers of fat rolls and things, you wouldn't have such an issue like this. It just tends to be doing straight transitions and adding a bit of colour here and there. But because of the way these folds go in and out on the lumpy flesh, you have to keep highlighting areas and shading in areas to make it all smooth and nice, and then decide how the light catches some of these. Some of the folds you'll want to highlight more to make them stand out, and some of them you'll want to keep dull. It's an important thing to remember not to highlight every area on the model to the same standard. You always want, well, providing you're doing this sort of painting. If you were doing Games Workshop style edge highlights, this isn't an issue at all. You just highlight edges. But if you're doing it like this, so you have a more realistic style of lighting, you have to always remember to keep the areas in shadow dulled down, because if you start highlighting them up, it'll look ridiculous. However, that option also allows you more lighting effects if you wanted. You can do things like underlighting. So if you wanted things to be underlit, it's really handy that everything on the lower side of the model is in shadow, because then you can use that for the contrast, to paint the underlighting onto them. So this style of painting is a much more you have to think much more about what you're doing and plan ahead compared to an edge highlighted model. However, one of the benefits of doing it this way is that you do not have to highlight every part of the model. And if you're used to painting that style, you have to actively stop yourself from highlighting every part of the model. Alright, so I just had a slight hiccup there. I had to pause the video and reset it, but so we're just carrying on painting the skin. You can see the skin on the arm now is actually starting to get some highlight and some nice transition. I painted the arm slightly more healthy, to look slightly more healthy than the belly. I didn't want everything to look like the belly, because then that takes away from the presence, I mean, the look of the nice disgusting belly area. And if you paint every area the same, as I was just saying with the highlighting, if you paint every area the same, then you've got nowhere. If you look at one part of the model, you've seen the whole model. Whereas if you paint it to have areas of interest and create contrast between these areas, then it's interesting to look at different areas of the model, because it's different and interesting things to look at. But it's it also, as I mentioned before, it just means that you have to think much harder about what you're doing and how you want the model to look as you paint it. And it does mean that, as I did on this one, where I changed the position and the look of some of the flesh on the belly, that you make changes as you go along, deciding if it looks better or worse as you do it. There's nothing wrong with experimenting as you're painting. It's generally not a good idea if you're doing a competition piece to just wing it. A bit of planning does help, but even then, it's always good to spend time looking at the model while you're painting it, or even just stop, take a break, and then come back to it, so you can have a look at what you've done and decide if the model looks, if it's going in the direction you want. What I actually do is, when I'm painting and I post a model on Instagram, I then use that picture and I look at it when I've stopped painting, so I can look at the model whenever I like, deciding if I think what I've done works well or not. And quite often you'll see I paint an area and then I post a picture of it, and then I'll post another picture another day where I've actually completely changed what I painted beforehand. Yeah, so there was I was interrupted there while I was painting, but it's well, it's just a case of continuing the same process. I'm trying to make it more interesting as I go throwing a few random tangents, because otherwise it's just a case of you add glazes and you paint the transitions. You might notice that I'm doing now is still going over areas that have already been pretty much finished, but there's just keep re-emphasizing them and pulling areas out, just to really make them pop out as important areas. And I really wanted that top right of the belly area to look bright, along with the top area of the chest and the sternum area, because that really does draw the eye into the centre of the model, and then you have the tongue just below that with the teeth around it. Because it's such a lovely visual area of the model, that contrast just helps it to stand out. Also, I just realised on the on the wet palette, there's some new colours appeared. Now the red and the purple are just minor things. So on the, well, for a start, the red is purely to fill in some more of the wounds, the gaping sores. The purple is to paint the veins on the model. I actually changed my mind for colours for veins on a few things. On the Lord of Plagues, I used, I think it was ultramarine blue. It was a blue anyway. It didn't matter too much. But then for this, I've changed it to an old Games Workshop purple. I think it was Warlock purple or something like that. It doesn't matter too much. You can just pick a purple or blue, whatever, because you paint, once you've painted the veins on, you'll then glaze on top of them, and that makes it look like the vein is beneath a layer of skin. And I'm going to paint the veins on the leg that was stepping forward. I'm just finishing off some of the highlights on it first before I put these veins on. Now the brown colour that you see there is Mournfang brown, and that is also not used on the skin. That's just used, well, it kind of is. So I'm using the Balor brown to pick out some of the pustules, and then to shade the pustules I've used the Balor brown, not Balor, the Mournfang brown, sorry, to go around those pustules for a nice bit of contrast. So here you can see me still going over some of these areas, really picking them out, make sure they stand out on the model. You can see on the brush tip there's such a small amount of paint. So even if I make a mistake and I smush the brush into the model, it's only going to make a small mark. And you also will see that most of the highlights I'm using are the slightly lighter shade mix of Cadian Fleshtone with the Pallid Witch Flesh. As I mentioned before, the Pallid Witch Flesh on its own is only for the very highest highlights. It's mainly the two central colours that are the highlights, and they work as highlights because the necrotic flesh is really dark. So although I said I've made a liar of myself. Although I said that the Mournfang brown here was for the pustules, which it is, I'm also using it in some of the folds here on the flesh just to add a touch of colour here and there. You can hardly see it on the model. I'll put a clearer picture on at the end so you can get a closer look, but it was just a case of me experimenting with the colours that were on the palette while they were there. I hadn't actually used Mournfang brown on the flesh previously. That's what happens when you start putting paint on the palette, and I think, oh, what can I do with that? So here you can see still going over these same areas over and over. It is one thing that you'd have to get used to for display standard painting, is that the finish needs to be so smooth that you just have to do lots and lots of very fine layers, and you'll keep going over them just to get a very high finish on the model. This is only relevant for display standard and close-up viewing of a model. If you were doing this for tabletop gaming, you don't need to do any of this. It takes a long time, and you get very little result from it. But because of the way that painting competitions are, if you don't have this high finish, you won't get trophies. So here you can see me using a bit more of the Skavenblight Dinge. I actually really like this colour. I mentioned before that it helps to transition the skin tones, and it also desaturates, tones down some of the flesh colour. I mentioned before about the saturation of the paint colours. If you just use straight Cadian flesh, then and you use it until it's completely opaque, it's very strong. So none of the colour that you see on the skin at the moment is a straight Cadian flesh that's purely opaque. All of it has transparency levels so that you can see some of the other colours that I've used mixed in. Now, depending on the type of skin that you want to paint, it might be a case of a completely opaque Cadian flesh tone would be suitable, but in this case it really wouldn't suit the style of the model. I don't think Nurgle works well with such a strong pinky flesh colour, mainly because he's kind of rotten. I'm just going over and over these areas. I'm sure it's not that interesting to watch, but that's what you have to do to get the finish on the model. Right, now here I'm going to paint on the veins on the leg. You can see that I'm just watering it down a little bit. The consistency for this, it needs to be slightly thick. You see as I drag the paint out there, it doesn't pool too much and doesn't run back into the paint. As I mentioned, I'm going to do some videos specifically on paint consistency, but to make the very fine marks for the veins, you need a paint that won't bleed at all as you apply it, but you still need the brush very sharp. Now, because you're going to glaze over this, you can have a very strong colour. If you weren't going to glaze over this, you would obviously have to mix a lighter colour to paint the details on. It all depends on what you're planning to do. But you should notice when I've painted this on that the veins look much stronger than you might expect. But when I finish glazing over the top of them, they look nice and soft and supple. Now, the glazing on top also makes the veins look even thinner and more, I say nicely painted, because it kind of softens the edges on them. So even though it's a thin line, softening that edge even further makes it look thinner. So it makes it look like you've painted a thinner line than maybe you actually can paint. This is just a small fleshy blob on the model that I was picking out there. I wasn't entirely sure what it was, but it had some dimples in. I thought I'd just pick out a couple of those as highlights. Sometimes on these models I have no idea what the thing is that I'm painting. It can be tricky in those situations, and you just kind of have to make your best guess as to what it is. Sometimes it's a result of the plastic forming, because it's hard to make perfect shapes all the time with plastic, due to the moulding, the moulds that they make. So sometimes areas are pulled or filled in that ideally they wouldn't be, and it makes it hard to figure out what it's supposed to be. You'll see that a lot on some of the older plastic Terminators on the backs of the legs. Their shapes are a bit wonky, or particularly as well on chainmail and plastic models. It will look like chainmail from the front angle, then if you turn it to the side it stretches straight back into the model, which is frustrating, but it's just something you have to live with when painting plastic models. The benefit of plastic models is that the detail and the finish of the model is much cleaner than if you're using resin. So generally speaking, plastic is easier to paint. And easier to build. It's just a case now that I'm going to be going over and over little areas, picking them out. It's very small refinements now. A good actual example of the consistency of the paint on the palette, you can see that there are marks where a light shines on the top Rhinox hide, and that shows that the paint is slightly thicker, whereas the obviously the paint in the wells, as you put the brush in and you take the paint out, it just goes straight back into a watery consistency. You don't notice any result of the paintbrush being through it. Now here you will see what I was highlighting is a tiny little hole under the the big gaping wound on his chest. So what I did was I first painted it in with the Rhinox hide, I think it was, or made in the purple, but it mixes in with the colour of the necrotic flesh around it. Then I was picking out one of the first highlight colours, just as very carefully underneath it, so you can actually see it. If you actually look on the model, it's such an incredibly small mark, but it's a nice idea to go around looking for these very tiny details and still make a note of them with the paintbrush, because it just adds more visual interest. You probably catch me repeating myself a lot in videos when I keep saying about visual interest, things like that. It's because I really want to stress that this is what makes these models nice to look at. It's all very well just having like a perfectly smooth flat colour and edge highlight, but that's all it is. You don't see any nice transitions, light reflections, details, things like that. It's impressive to look at for cleanliness and precision, but it's not very expressive. However, you can still use that if you use that style and to contrast it with areas of nice lighting and textures and things like that, so you get even more interest on the model. It's always, you just have to decide how you want your model to look, make areas that you want to have focal points, and then use techniques to make those focal points. So it could be that you want something to have a bright light on it, then you use techniques around that area that are duller, that don't attract the eye. Or if you want things to look damaged, then you can have a very smooth, flat finish, and then that creates a contrast with it. So here's the finished skin. You can see how the fist has now moved along from the previous videos, and also added a few touches like the glowing eyes. I will do another video on the leather boots, but that's it for the skin. Hope you enjoyed it.